December 31st, 2006. In an office inside the British Treasury, a routine payment is processed, $83 million wired to the United States government. No press conference, no front-page headline, no victory parade. Just a final transfer, a number on a screen, closing a ledger that had been open since 1946. With that quiet transaction, Britain finishes paying for World War II. 61 years after the guns fell silent, 3 generations of British taxpayers have finally settled the bill. But here's the twist most people never hear. That bill was not for winning the war. It was the price Britain paid simply to stay in it. We are told a comforting story. America, the generous arsenal of democracy, stepped in to save Britain from Hitler, and afterward, the paperwork of debt was just a formality. Look a little deeper into the contracts, the negotiations, the conditions attached to that aid, and a darker picture comes into focus. The debt that ended in 2006 was not just about tanks and planes. It was the final payment on a financial operation that turned Britain from the world's richest empire into a dependent, indebted power. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States orchestrated one of the largest peaceful transfers of wealth in human history. Britain entered World War II as the world's leading creditor nation, commanding an empire that covered roughly a quarter of the planet's land surface. It exited the war bankrupt. Its gold reserves had been shipped abroad and spent. Its overseas investments were liquidated at discount prices. Strategic bases in the Atlantic and Caribbean had been leased away for almost a century. On top of that, Britain owed Washington around $31 billion, roughly $486 billion in today's money. And yet, even that headline number is not the real cost. The real price was the slow dismantling of the British Empire itself as an economic system. This wasn't charity. It wasn't just a partnership against fascism. It was a controlled liquidation, an empire sold off piece by piece, disguised as aid. The United States did not conquer Britain with tanks and marines. It captured Britain's future through contracts, loans, and conditions. In this story, the most powerful weapons are not bombers and battleships, but balance sheets and legal clauses. In the next chapters, we'll see how Lend-Lease really worked, what Britain was forced to sell to keep fighting, who made fortunes from that forced liquidation, why American aid was cut off just 7 days after Japan surrendered, and how a single loan in 1946 quietly finished off what remained of British economic independence. This isn't just a World War II story. It's a blueprint. The mechanisms used on Britain in 1941, debt, dependency, enforced liberalization, and the strategic use of crisis, are the same tools used on strategic allies today. To understand the modern dollar empire, you have to understand how the pound empire was dismantled. And that begins with one extraordinary letter. December 8th, 1940. Winston Churchill sits down to write to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Outside, Britain is burning. German U-boats are tearing apart merchant convoys in the Atlantic, trying to starve the island into submission. The Luftwaffe is bombing London and other cities almost nightly. British forces have already been driven from France. The Empire needs everything: aircraft, tanks, fuel, ammunition, merchant ships, food, raw materials. Churchill lays out the military situation in his letter. It reads like a status report from a man standing on the edge of a cliff. And then he writes the sentence that changes the fate of the British Empire. Britain is out of money. Not merely under strain, not facing difficulties, but effectively bankrupt. The British Treasury can no longer pay cash for American supplies. 7 months into what will become a 6-year war, the world's greatest creditor nation has burned through its liquid assets. Most history books present this letter as a noble plea between allies, the moment the embattled island appeals to the conscience of the New World. But in financial terms, Churchill is doing something else. He is negotiating the terms under which Britain will liquidate its wealth, what will be sold, what will be pledged, and what will be sacrificed to keep the war going a few more months. Because before the war, Britain was not some fragile underdog clinging to life. Before September 1939, the British Empire was the richest integrated system of power on Earth. It ruled over 35.5 million square kilometers, about 24% of the world's land surface. British citizens owned around $22 billion in overseas investments, roughly $450 billion in today's money. These weren't just numbers in a ledger. They were railways carving across the plains of Argentina, copper mines in Chile, rubber plantations in Malaya, oil fields in Persia. From Calcutta to Cairo to the Caribbean, profits flowed back to London. The City of London was the financial heart of the world. The pound sterling functioned as the global reserve currency. Merchants priced goods and settled debts in pounds, not dollars. Britain held about $6 billion worth of gold reserves, second only to the United States. For a century, London had been the banker to the world. And yet, within just 7 months of total war, that seemingly unshakable position was collapsing. The question is, how does a financial fortress like that fall so quickly? The answer lies in American law. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States remained officially neutral. The horror of World War I still haunted the American psyche. Nobody wanted to be dragged into another European catastrophe. Congress codified that reluctance into a series of neutrality acts, designed to keep America out of foreign wars. But inside those laws was a small phrase with enormous consequences: cash and carry. Under cash and carry, any belligerent power could buy American weapons and supplies, but only if they paid cash up front and transported the goods on their own ships. No credit, no loans, no "we'll pay later." Gold, dollars, or nothing. For Britain, that clause was a financial guillotine. The empire needed American industry, the steel of Pittsburgh, the automobiles and aircraft of Detroit, the oil of Texas. There was simply no alternative scale of supply. So Britain began to spend. In June 1940, the British government launched Operation Fish, one of the most extraordinary financial missions in history. Warships and civilian liners were loaded not with troops, but with gold bars and securities. Convoys carrying the financial core of the British Empire sailed across U-boat-infested waters to Canada and the United States. In total, around $7 billion in gold and negotiable securities crossed the Atlantic. At that time, the largest physical movement of wealth the world had ever seen. Britain was literally shipping its treasure abroad to pay American bills. By November 1940, the unthinkable had happened. The gold was effectively gone. Yet British representatives in Washington were still placing orders for aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and supplies. The demands of war did not pause because the vaults were empty. Finally, the Treasury in London had to send the message no empire ever wants to send. There were no dollars left. Britain, the greatest creditor nation on earth just months earlier, was now out of liquid means to pay. That's the point where the legend of Lend-Lease usually begins, where Roosevelt, the benevolent statesman, supposedly invents a clever workaround to help Britain without angering isolationists at home. The official story goes like this: instead of selling weapons, America will lend them. Britain will lease equipment, use it for the duration, and then return it after the war, like borrowing a garden hose to put out a neighbor's house fire. It's a simple, almost charming analogy. But behind the speeches, behind the arsenal of democracy branding, Lend-Lease was something very different. The real terms were shaped in private negotiations between desperate British officials and one man who understood exactly how to use crisis to reshape the world: Henry Morgenthau Jr., the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau was not in the business of charity. He was not moved by romantic notions of shared civilization or poetic letters from Churchill. He dealt in numbers, collateral, and leverage. Before a single dollar of Lend-Lease was approved, Morgenthau demanded a full audit of the British Empire. Not just government assets, everything. Every major asset owned by the British state and by British citizens worldwide. Companies, railways, plantations, mines, securities. He wanted to know in detail what Britain still had left to sell. Picture the context. London is under nightly bombardment. U-boats are sinking thousands of tons of shipping. The shadow of a possible German invasion has not completely vanished. And in the middle of this, the price of American aid is financial nakedness. Open your books, show us your wealth, prove you are truly broke. Sir Frederick Phillips, leading the British side, is shocked. He explains that the gold is already gone. He warns that forcing Britain to sell long-term investments in the middle of a world war will trigger a fire sale, destroying value built up over generations. Those assets aren't just numbers. They are the income streams that will sustain Britain after the war, if they survive. Strip them now, he argues, and Britain will win the war, but lose its future. Morgenthau is unmoved. From his perspective, if Britain still owns prime assets, companies in America, securities, investments, why should US taxpayers foot the bill? The logic is brutally simple. Liquidate everything you can. Only after that will America discuss aid. In that cold negotiation, you can see the birth of a new kind of empire, one that conquers with contracts instead of armies. In Britain, cornered and exhausted, is about to start selling off its inheritance. Morgenthau now needed proof, concrete, public proof, that Britain was truly on its knees. In Washington, isolationist congressmen were insisting that Britain was secretly rich, that the empire was trying to trick America into paying its bills while still sitting on a mountain of hidden wealth. To get Lend-Lease through Congress, Morgenthau had to produce a sacrifice. He found it in a company called American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest producer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was not some marginal holding. It was a jewel of industrial America, owned by a British firm called Courtaulds. The company was worth over $100 million and generated around $10 million a year in dividends flowing back to London, a reliable stream of income that helped fund the British economy. Morgenthau told the British negotiators bluntly, "Sell it, not eventually, not when the war is over. Sell it now and deposit the proceeds with the US Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders." The British delegation pushed back. Selling American Viscose under wartime pressure would mean accepting a brutally low price. Everyone on Wall Street knew Britain was desperate. Everyone knew they were being forced to sell. This was the worst possible moment to unload a prime asset. But Morgenthau was firm. Either American Viscose is sold or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. The message was clear. You want lifeline money? Start amputating limbs. On March 15, 1941, the British government used emergency war powers to seize American Viscose from its private owners. It was a compulsory purchase inside Britain, with the state paying Courtaulds in pounds at home, creating more internal debt. Then, across the Atlantic, American bankers handled the sale of American Viscose to US buyers. They knew they were dealing with a forced seller. They squeezed as hard as they could. The company was sold for $54.4 million, roughly half its real value. The dollars from that sale did not go to Courtaulds. They went straight into the US Treasury to pay down Britain's existing obligations. It was a foreclosure by another name. An ally forced to sell one of its best assets at a discount to satisfy a creditor in the middle of a war. And American Viscose was only the beginning. Under constant pressure from Morgenthau's treasury, Britain began dumping its American securities. British citizens had built up portfolios of US stocks and bonds over decades, shares in industrial giants, railroads, utilities, manufacturers. These were precisely the kinds of assets that, held long enough, anchor national wealth. Between late 1940 and mid-1941, Britain liquidated around $650 million worth of American securities held by private British investors and institutions. In total, by the middle of 1941, Britain had sold about $1.1 billion of American investments, roughly $22 billion in today's money. Every sale was tracked, recorded, and verified by the US Treasury. Only after this purge of assets did Lend-Lease funds begin to flow in earnest. The symbolism is hard to miss. Empire first, aid second. When you strip away the rhetoric, the message is, before America lends you $1, you will sell everything you can. But not all of the deals were purely financial. Some were geopolitical pawnbroking on a grand scale. As early as September 1940, before Lend-Lease formally existed, Britain struck the Destroyers for Bases deal with the United States. Britain desperately needed destroyers to protect Atlantic convoys from German U-boats. Roosevelt agreed to provide 50 old U.S. Navy destroyers, aging veterans of World War I, pulled out of mothballs. Many were obsolete, rusting, and in need of serious repairs. In exchange, the United States was granted 99-year leases on sites for military bases across the Western Hemisphere: Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, British Guiana. On paper, it looked like a reasonable swap, ships for bases. In reality, it was Britain pawning the long-term strategic control of the North Atlantic and Caribbean to secure temporary help. Those bases became the backbone of American power in the Atlantic: airfields, naval stations, listening posts. With one deal, the United States leapfrogged into formal military presence across territory long dominated by the British Empire. And in return, Britain got 50 aging destroyers that the US Navy no longer wanted. It was, geopolitically, like trading a crumbling mansion for a borrowed tent. In the short term, it helped Britain survive. In the long term, it helped ensure that the post-war oceans would belong to the United States. While these asset sales and base leases were being hammered out, Roosevelt pushed Lend-Lease through Congress. On March 11, 1941, the Lend-Lease Act became law. It authorized an initial $7 billion in aid, eventually expanding to about $50 billion spread among allied nations. Of that, roughly $31 billion would go to Britain alone over the course of the war. American newspapers and propaganda celebrated it as proof that the US was the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt told Americans that their factories would arm the free world against tyranny, while American boys stayed home, at least for the moment. For Britain, the program was existential. Without American trucks, planes, fuel, food, and raw materials, it is hard to see how Britain could have remained in the war. Lend-Lease kept British industry supplied just enough to fight on. But the name of the law itself gives away the truth that later got buried under myth. It was not grant and gift. It was lend and lease. The underlying understanding was simple. This is not free. There will be a reckoning. The true weapon of the Act was hidden in the legal boilerplate, in a clause known innocently as Article 7. At first glance, Article 7 looks like a nod to idealistic free trade. It required Britain, in return for aid, to agree that after the war there would be no discriminatory treatment in international commerce among member nations. Sounds harmless, even noble. But discriminatory treatment was code. Code for the system that held the British Empire together economically. Imperial preference. For years, the Empire had relied on a web of tariffs and trade rules that gave British goods preferential treatment in imperial markets. If you were in Canada, Australia, India, or South Africa, British products were cheaper than foreign products because of these tariff advantages. British manufacturers could survive, even when American cars or machines were technically better, because in Empire markets, the tax system tilted the playing field their way. Article 7 demanded that Britain dismantle this system after the war. No more special treatment for British goods inside the Empire. American products would be allowed to compete freely. For the British negotiators, this was a nightmare clause. They understood exactly what it meant. The economic glue of the Empire would be dissolved. Britain would lose its captive markets just as it emerged from the most expensive war in its history. But bombs were falling. Food was rationed. The U-boats were still prowling the sea lanes. Britain signed. In effect, the British leadership mortgaged the post-war empire to pay for the weapons needed to survive the war itself. The deal kept the island alive, but it planted a time bomb in the imperial economy. As the war dragged on, the imbalance in the Anglo-American relationship only deepened. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry entered a golden age. US GDP soared by roughly 75%. Factories ran around the clock producing tanks, planes, ships, guns, ammunition, and, crucially, consumer goods. America was not just weaponizing its industrial base. It was quietly positioning itself to dominate the peacetime markets that would follow. Britain, by contrast, threw almost everything into the war effort. British factories were converted almost entirely to military production. Civilian exports collapsed. For decades, Britain had fed the world with textiles, machinery, and manufactured goods. During the war, those markets were simply abandoned. They didn't stay empty for long. American companies moved in. While British workers were assembling Spitfires and bombers, American workers were building both warplanes and refrigerators, radios, cars, tractors. When Latin America, Asia, and Africa needed goods, they increasingly bought American, not British. In other words, America was fighting the war and simultaneously colonizing Britain's future customers, peacefully, through commerce. By 1944, the financial gravity of the world had shifted. Gold that once piled up in London now sat in Fort Knox. The pound sterling was weakening. The dollar was rising. Bretton Woods, the post-war monetary system designed that year, would merely formalize a reality already created by years of transfers. The center of global finance had crossed the Atlantic. Yet through all this, many in the British establishment believed that the post-war settlement would be fair. They assumed that after the war the United States would recognize Britain's early sacrifice, those lonely years before 1941 when Britain stood against Hitler essentially alone, and would show generosity. Maybe large grants, maybe write-offs, at least a soft landing. They believed, in short, that there was a moral credit account that matched the financial debt. They were wrong. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. Crowds filled the streets in London, cheering outside Buckingham Palace. After 6 years of war, the empire had survived. 7 days later, on August 21st, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated, immediately and completely. American ships loaded with supplies for Britain and other allies received orders in mid-ocean to turn around and return home. No transition, no winding down period, no gradual tapering of support. The lifeline had been cut in a single stroke. In London, the shock was profound. The British government had assumed that aid would continue, at least for a while, during the critical transition from war to peace. Instead, they found themselves facing a cliff. The British economy had been distorted entirely toward war production. Factories needed time and investment to retool for civilian production. The country was importing roughly half its food and the bulk of its raw materials, and those imports had been effectively subsidized by Lend-Lease. Without that flow of support, the numbers no longer worked. An uncomfortable truth came into view. Britain could win the war and still starve in peace. John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most brilliant economist of the century, looked at the figures and saw what he called a financial Dunkirk. Within months, without external help, Britain would face default, severe import cuts and rationing that might push the population toward actual hunger. Once again, there was only one path left. Go back to Washington, not as an equal partner, but as a supplicant. And this time, there would be no talk of garden hoses, only hard terms. In September 1945, with the war barely over, John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for America. He was 62, exhausted, and gravely ill. For years he had bent his genius to managing wartime finance, patching Britain's accounts with improvisation and intellect. Now he was crossing the Atlantic not as the celebrated architect of modern economics, but as the representative of a bankrupt empire. Keynes believed Britain had a moral claim. For 2 years, from 1940 to late 1941, Britain had fought Hitler essentially alone, while the United States stayed neutral. Britain had burned through its gold, its overseas assets, and its future to hold the line. In Keynes's mind, that sacrifice should be recognized. He argued that America should provide a grant, not a loan, on the order of $6 billion. Not charity, but justice. A retroactive payment for having bought time for the world. When Keynes arrived in Washington, he discovered that justice was not a line item in the US budget. American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson at the Treasury, listened politely and then returned to hard numbers. The war was over. American voters wanted demobilization and lower taxes, not another open-ended commitment to Europe. Congress distrusted Britain's new Labour government, which had just swept into power on a platform including nationalization of key industries. The result was blunt. There would be no gift, only a loan. The Americans offered $3.75 billion at 2% interest. It was barely enough to keep Britain afloat, and it came with strings designed to reshape the post-war economic order. The harshest condition was buried, again, in financial jargon. Sterling convertibility. During the war, Britain had forced its empire and allies, the so-called sterling area, to accept payment in pounds rather than dollars. Those pounds were trapped. They could be used to buy British goods, but not freely converted into US dollars. This created a closed loop that protected British industry and preserved scarce dollar reserves. The Americans wanted that system dismantled. As a condition of the 1946 loan, Britain agreed that within 1 year of receiving the funds, the pound sterling would become fully convertible into dollars. On paper, it sounded like a step toward a modern, open trading system. In reality, it was a trap. Everyone holding sterling, India, Egypt, other colonies and allies, had been accumulating a currency they could not freely spend. The moment convertibility was allowed, they would have a simple choice. Keep pounds or swap them for dollars and buy American goods. Keynes saw the danger instantly. He knew that once the pound was made convertible, there would be a flood out of sterling and into dollars. draining Britain's reserves and undermining the very loan that was supposed to help. He fought against the convertibility clause, but his health was failing and the alternatives were brutal. Without the loan, Britain faced famine-level rationing and immediate default. Once again, survival today was bought with a piece of tomorrow. Keynes collapsed under the strain. He died in April 1946, before the loan agreement formally came into effect in July. The man who had tried to save Britain's future died watching his country sign away one of its last tools of economic control. Then came the winter of 1947. It was one of the coldest in modern British history. Coal froze in rail wagons, power stations shut down, factories went dark, families huddled in unheated homes, wrapped in blankets. The country that had just won a world war was now rationing electricity. And in the middle of this frozen crisis, the American condition came due. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound fully convertible, as promised. The result was immediate and devastating. The moment the window opened, holders of sterling around the world rushed to the banks. They dumped pounds and demanded dollars. With dollars, they could buy American machinery, American cars, American consumer goods, products that after years of war looked modern and abundant compared to anything Britain could offer. In a matter of weeks, Britain's precious dollar reserves hemorrhaged. Hundreds of millions drained out as sterling balances were converted and sent to the United States. In just over a month, a quarter of the loan had effectively vanished. On August 20, 1947, barely 5 weeks after convertibility began, Britain was forced to slam the door shut, suspending convertibility to stop the bleeding. The experiment had lasted long enough to prove the Americans right about who now dominated world trade, and long enough to prove Keynes right about what it would do to Britain. The humiliation was total. Britain had followed the rules, honoured the agreement, and been punished by the mathematics of the new order. The economic consequences rippled outward into geopolitics. For a century, Britain had acted as a kind of imperial policeman in regions like the Eastern Mediterranean. It had propped up governments in Greece and Turkey, in part to block Soviet influence. By early 1947, London could no longer carry the cost. In February that year, Britain quietly informed Washington that it could not afford to continue supporting Greece and Turkey. If the United States wanted to stop Soviet expansion there, it would have to step in. Washington did. The Truman Doctrine was born. The United States formally assumed responsibility for containing communism in those regions. The baton of global leadership, held by Britain since the 19th century, passed decisively to America. 2 years later, in 1949, the British government took another painful step. Still struggling with weak exports and chronic shortages, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became roughly 30% poorer in international terms. Imports became more expensive, foreign travel more out of reach, national prestige more symbolic than real. The country that had once set the terms of global finance now had to adjust its own currency to survive inside a system it no longer controlled. Meanwhile, the United States sat atop an unprecedented pile of wealth and power. By 1945, it held around 2/3 of the world's official gold reserves. The Bretton Woods system, agreed that same year, anchored the international monetary order on the US dollar, nominally convertible into gold. American military bases sprawled across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The British Empire had not been erased overnight, but its economic core had been cracked and hollowed out. And the debt that symbolized that shift did not disappear. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not forgiven. It carried 2% annual interest, quietly serviced through decades of political swings. The post-war labor reforms, the austerity of the 1950s, the inflationary 1970s, Thatcher's privatizations, Blair's cool Britannia. Every year, the British Treasury sent payments across the Atlantic. The final installment arrived in December 2006. A war that ended in 1945 continued echoing in budget lines 61 years later. Who benefited from this great transfer? In personal terms, Henry Morgenthau Jr. left office after the war wealthy and respected, never publicly punished for having stripped an ally in its darkest hour. American investment banks like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs earned fat fees handling forced sales of British assets. The buyers of American Viscose, who acquired it for $54.4 million when it was worth roughly double that, saw instant gains. US industrial giants, Boeing, Lockheed, Ford, General Motors, made billions supplying Lend-Lease material. The US government itself emerged with global monetary dominance, a network of bases, and a set of allies whose security depended on American protection and American credit. The British Empire had not been conquered in battle. It had been bought in a distressed sale. And Britain, lacking options, had signed the paperwork. The pattern did not stop with Britain. After the war, West Germany was rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid, but aid came with conditions. Germany had to open its markets to American goods, align its foreign policy with Washington, and host permanent US bases. It became prosperous, but within a framework set by the United States. Japan, shattered in 1945, was rebuilt under American occupation. Its economy was restructured, its politics reshaped. To this day, US bases dot Japanese soil, and Japan holds hundreds of billions of dollars in US Treasury bonds, a creditor, but one tightly bound within the dollar system. South Korea, after the Korean War, followed a similar script. Massive American aid, heavy US military presence, and deep structural influence over economic and security policy. The countries got wealth and security. The United States got influence and leverage. The formula is consistent. Crisis creates dependency, dependency forces concessions, concessions transfer wealth and sovereignty upward. What happened to Britain in 1940-1947 was simply the prototype, applied to a former great power instead of a defeated enemy. The mythology of World War II tells us that America saved Britain. There is truth in that. Without American supplies, Britain might well have collapsed. But that is only half the story. The other half is that America used Britain's desperation to negotiate away imperial preference, seize strategic bases, drain gold and investments, and install the dollar where sterling once stood. Britain defeated Hitler, but in doing so, it signed away the economic foundations of its empire. Churchill's letter in December 1940 is remembered as a plea for help. In financial terms, it was a deed of sale. He traded an empire for survival. In the short run, it was the only choice. In the long run, it meant that 3 generations of British citizens would live with the consequences: a smaller role in the world, a weaker currency, and a quiet annual payment to the new empire across the sea. Lend-Lease is sold in textbooks as the arsenal of democracy, a story of selfless generosity. Look at the contracts, and it becomes something else. The greatest asset-stripping operation in modern history, executed while bombs were falling, cloaked in the language of friendship. Today, the tools are more sophisticated: reserve currencies, sovereign debt markets, defense agreements, supply chains. But the logic remains. When your ally is desperate, when they are trapped by war, crisis, or financial collapse, that is when terms are written, markets pried open, and assets change hands. Empires are no longer built by redrawing maps with armies. They are built by rewriting contracts with a pen. If you want to understand how alliances really work, don't just listen to the speeches. Read the clauses, follow the money, and remember what happened when Britain thought it was being rescued and discovered it was being bought.